Welcome back to the Forge of Sagas. In today's video, we're going to be taking advantage of some discount Halloween decorations and turning them into an entire table's worth of terrain for your Dungeons & Dragons, Age of Sigmar, or other fantasy-themed wargames or tabletop RPGs. You can imagine how giants once fought and died over this landscape, only to have their bones unearthed again for those stalking the realm to find. So, without further ado, let's get started. The first step of any build is to take stock of what you got, and here you can see I've dumped out my bones on my work table. But you can see there's a little bit of an edge on these where the plastic flowed through the mold, so we're just going to go ahead and start by removing that with our knife. Make sure you don't slice through the bone, as some places have really thin walls, so just take your time with this as you go about it. Make sure that you have all the edges nice and clean before we move on. Now it's time to get a little bit of order to our bones. These bones just kind of came in a bag. They're a random assortment you could scatter on your lawn, and I will leave a link to a place I found you can still purchase them in the description below. But I'm just here grouping them by different parts of the body. You know, I've got ribs, arms, hips, skull, etc. Just trying to get things a little bit organized so I know what I've got to work with so I can start thinking about what I want to build. The first thing we're going to do is make some barricades, and that's a great use for some of the smaller bones like this as well as the spine. You can just lay them out in a piece of chipboard and grab a miniature just to see and make sure that they're going to be the right height for a barricade. Here we'll grab my trusty Space Marine and see if it's going to work, and I line them up. It's a good height for a barricade. You could take cover behind that. Once you've decided the pieces you're going to do this with, you can go ahead and grab some chipboard and cut out a base. You just trace it out with a pencil, make a nice irregular shape that's going to look nice and organic on your tabletop, and then cut it out with a pair of scissors. Once you have the base cut out, all you have to do is secure it in place with some hot glue. The transition between the cardboard and the plastic bone might look a little awkward right now, but don't worry about it. We're going to come in and blend that together a little bit later using some spackle. But for now, let's move on to another part of the build. When I looked at the ribs, I knew I wanted to create kind of a little cage that people could hide in, maybe make a little passageway under it or whatever, but with only 2 ribs, that wasn't going to work. So, I grabbed my plastic cutters and snipped them in half. That way, instead of 2 ribs, I have 4 ribs. I knew this was going to end up being a bigger piece, so I grabbed 2 sizable pieces of pink XPS foam and joined them together using some cocktail skewers and hot glue. Once those pieces were secure, I grabbed some other pieces that I'd cut using the hot wire foam cutter you can see behind me and started to toy around with the layout. I ended up deciding that what I could do here that would be cool is to create a little bit of an underpass where the ribs arch over a little valley in the mountainside. However, since we're not gluing this piece together quite yet, I'm just going to lay these out upside down. We'll flip them over when it comes time to assemble this piece. To make another large piece of line of sight blocking terrain, I figured it would be cool to have a hand that's stretching up out of the ground and then resting on the top of the hill. My favorite part about builds like this is trying to keep everything centered around the focal material of the build, which in this case is our Halloween bones, while still creating terrain that is both visually appealing and functional for rules purposes. Here's the final layout for this piece. You can see I've added a ledge on the left side of your screen just to give miniatures a little bit extra place to stand, as well as raised up the fingers a little bit so that models can get under it. Matter of fact, it was still a little low here, so I grabbed a thin piece of scrap and used that to raise up the hand even more. My original plan for basing was to only add this small chipboard offshoot, but I ended up trimming the arms a little bit and bringing them closer to the mountain so that I could fit the entire piece on one piece of chipboard. For the piece I wanted to do with the pelvis, it was just a little bit too hard to work without gluing things down. So I grabbed some hot glue and put in my first piece of foam so that I could properly align the other bones that I had. My goal with this piece was to have the bones sunk into the ground as little as possible, therefore creating the maximum amount of cover for any miniatures that I could put on there. I then grabbed an offcut piece of foam and carved it so that it would wrap around the back of the pelvis bone. I figured this would add a cool little height element and just break up the silhouette a little more. I did something very similar with this femur that I cut in half, just taking 2 pieces of foam and carving a little notch into them that the bone would sit in nicely at an angle that would be interesting. I recommend you make these cuts a little bit at a time and dry fit constantly, just to make sure you don't end up with any awkward gaps. An important safety reminder here is when you're cutting foam with a hot wire cutter, work in a well-ventilated environment and make sure that you wear a protective mask. I figured I could take the other half of that femur and use the fact that it's hollow to just stab it into the foam here and have it resting against another tower of rock. I then came in and carved out the gap that my bone is going to sit in, just like I did in the last one. This is a nice simple shape, but it's going to look good on the tabletop. The skull I got from this box was really big, relative to miniature scale obviously. So I decided I could get 2 pieces of terrain out of this instead of 1 by cutting it in half with my knife. I cut it at an angle just so that it would sit on the ground in an interesting fashion and it wouldn't just be straight in half or just the bottom or top. However, certain parts of this piece were a little bit thicker than I had originally anticipated, especially near the top of the skull. So I opted to grab my Dremel and finish cutting with that. Remember when working with a tool like this to not only wear a mask, but also protective eyewear. Safety first. I cut the jaw in half and then took 1 piece of the skull and traced out a base on some chipboard. Not every terrain feature has to be really tall, and let's face it, the skull is already pretty tall by itself, so we can just go ahead and rest this one in the dirt. Once we've cut out a nice little irregular shape, we can go ahead and grab our hot glue gun and glue this skull in place. For the other half of the skull, I decided to embed that in some foam rocks. So I took the skull itself and used it as a jig to help cut out a piece of foam that would contour precisely to the curves of the skull. That way the pieces would mesh together really nicely. Once those 2 pieces were set, it was just a matter of coming in and playing with the piece until I found an arrangement of the jaw and other rocks that I liked. I took that long piece and sliced it into 2 different pieces, one medium size, one small size, just to create this nice little step look. For a little bit of a smaller piece of terrain, I figured this hand would make a nice little cave that you could take cover in. Reminds me a little bit of Zazu during The Lion King when he's imprisoned by Scar. But that thumb pointing up is not really going to work for me. So I grabbed my clippers and broke it off. That way it would lay nicely on the ground and still give the nice shape of a hand, while only the 4 fingers pointing up would be supported. It's a little bit more of a natural position for a hand to be in when someone dies. However, you guys know me. I have a weakness for building big pieces, so we're going to do another big piece. Took these 2 bones from the arm and decided to lay them out so that the longer bone was stretching over this gap. This is a cool formation that we see in nature where erosion has carved out a bit of a valley and created a spire, but also as a gameplay mechanic, it can cause charges to bottleneck and therefore perhaps restrict the amount of models that can actually fight. The last piece I decided to make was this little archway of bone made out of a knee joint. I had these 2 little weird shapes as leftover offcuts, so I figured this would be something cool that I could do. Initially I hot glued these together, but it made the joint look kinda ugly, so I just decided to pull them apart and keep them as 2 separate pieces at the end of the build. However, the hot glue did help me keep the angle straight while I did this build, so there's something to be said for it still. Once everything was laid out how I wanted it, I came in with some Loctite construction adhesive and glued everything together. This stuff's a little bit more durable and creates a better bond than hot glue or other adhesives, so I like it for putting big blocks of foam together to create some nice durable terrain. I let the glue set overnight, and then the next day I came in with my hot wire foam cutter and started carving up the rocks. I just kind of attacked it in a random pattern, just trying to remove some of the sharp edges and other places where the foam was a little bit ripped up from me being lazy when I cut it and not using the sharpest knife in the world. But, you know, this is something that you do to taste. Do what looks right, play around with it, just try and remember what natural rock formations look like. They'll have some jagged edges, but a lot of them will be a little bit more rounded due to erosion from water, wind, etc. Just play around with it until you're happy. Another thing to make sure you do is when you're adding bones later, like I am here with the jaw, make sure that you carve a spot for them to sit nicely. So, a little bit of a dry fit, then come in with the old hot glue and secure it in place. To give you another quick example, here's a piece that I did where I had an ankle joint that was supported on some rocks, and again, just came in, carved everything really nicely, and made sure that I created channels for these bones to sit so that they would rest naturally on the rocks. However, when you start carving, one of the things you might realize is that your height profile changes a little bit, so you might have to make some adjustments to your bones along the way. As with all things, make sure you go slowly and constantly dry fit to make sure that you don't cut away too much bone. For our bone archway, I pushed the pieces of bone into the foam, then came in with some hot glue and just applied it right in the channel. That way I knew it was exactly where I needed the bone to go. Pushed it in there, and let it harden. Too easy. With everything in place, it's time to do a little gap filling and blending with some spackle. We're going to use this to help unite some of the rock faces and give them a little bit more of a natural curve, as well as to blend the bone elements into our piece, whether that's blending it into the mountainside with some additional rock, or into the ground where we see the dirt has kind of pushed up against the bones. That way it gives the impression that there's more bones submerged into the rock or earth. I had to do a little bit of extra gap filling with the skull where it met the base, just because the angle I had cut the skull at didn't 100% line up with how I put it on the piece. However, just go ahead and use a little bit more spackle to fill in that gap, and make sure you get a nice amount of contact between the plastic bone and the base, just to make sure it really locks itself in place. Once I'd let the spackle dry overnight, I came in with an old brush and applied some Mod Podge everywhere there was exposed foam. This is going to help protect the foam from the accelerant and the spray paint that we're going to use to prime it. That way we don't damage the foam at all and lose the shapes we spent so long carving out. I primed it white because that's what I had laying around, and then for my base layer of the rocks, I came in with a peppercorn gray, nice and dark, give us a good solid base to build up from. After 2 coats of that, I came in with an overbrush of a medium gray. Overbrushing is just essentially a very heavy dry brush. You're looking for about 75% coverage, just to help establish that more natural stone color, leaving the dark gray in only the deepest recesses. Next, I grabbed a lighter gray and came in with a fairly aggressive dry brush. Here I was only looking for about 30% coverage, and you can see it looks very bright here, but once it dries, it comes out much duller and gives us a really nice set of highlights on most of the details and really starts to bring this piece together. You can see it dried to a really nice finish, and I'm very happy with that, but now we're going to come in with one more dry brush with a very light gray, and just try and clip the high edges. This is going to help add that last little bit of detail that's really going to make the edges of our rocks pop. With the rocks done, it's time to turn our attention to the ground. I started with a little bit of a warm brown just to give it that soil color. This is going to serve as a nice undertone for everything else we're going to build up. Once that had dried, I came in with a slightly richer brown and gave it a gentle overbrush. This is going to create some variance in the dirt, just a little bit of variety of color that might catch the eye and establish a little bit more visual interest. Next, I grabbed a foliage green and stippled that in a random pattern onto the base. This is going to give us an undercoat for our foliage, which we'll add during our flocking step, and it just helps to overall increase the vibrancy of the piece. If you just flock over the base brown, I find that the dirt shows through a little bit too much and you can lose some of the vibrancy of the grass. So for me, I like adding in this little stippling of green. Once that had dried, I repeated the process with an olive green. Just like with the 2 different types of browns, it's going to create those slight visual differences. It's going to add a lot of appeal to your piece. Last but not least, it's time for the bones. And to start, I came in with this caramel yellow. Now this seems like a really aggressive color to start, but remember that this is only our base coat. This is really going to reinforce the agedness of the bones. These have been here for a long time, and once we get all of our other layers on, it's going to look really nice. Here you can see I've got a smaller brush, just because I want to be very careful to try and nick the rocks as little as possible. I can be a bit of a sloppy painter, so I know I'm going to have to go in and do a little bit of a touch-up, but the less touching up I have to do, the better. Once I did 2 layers of that, I came in with a makeup brush and did a pretty heavy dry brush of this light tan. This is going to really start to bring that bone color into effect, and I really liked using the makeup brush for this, as I could be pretty aggressive with the brush placement, but I didn't have to worry about the paint going anywhere that I didn't intend it to. The makeup brush really kept the paint only where I wanted it to go on the bone and not having it drifting off onto the rocks, so I really loved it for this part of this process. Now you can see I promised. We did that weird undercoat, but that's a nice looking bone. But we're going to give it a little bit more of a highlight just by using an even lighter tan. Just come in and hit the high points just to create that little bit of extra variance in color that's going to bring this piece to life. Once you finish touching up any spots that you might have nicked, it's time to go on to flocking. Here we're going to use some clump foliage and just hot glue it in place on a couple of different spots on the terrain. This is another cool way if at some point maybe you broke a little bit of the foam and there's some paint showing through, or there's a little bit of a join that you're not so comfortable with how it looks, you can use this to cover it up and nobody will know. Another thing you can do which is very cool is creeping vines, and for that I grabbed some Spanish moss that I found in the floral arranging section of my local dollar store. Here you can see I'm using a glue stick to help it stick in place, but because of the way it naturally wants to curl around things just because of how it is, you can just stick it in place and a lot of times it'll just hold really nicely. But if you want to put it in specific locations, like maybe growing from behind this bush and trailing up this wall, a little bit of hot glue will definitely help it stick in place. You don't want to extrude too much, just give it just the tiniest bit so that you can't see it, but it'll help hold it in place very nicely. Do it at the top, do it at the bottom, and let the rest of it hang freely. Gives it a nice natural feel. This is my first time using the Spanish moss, so I decided to experiment a lot with it to see what adhesives would be best for sticking it in different places, because as you can see, it makes a really nice climbing vine. But, after trying PVA glue, Eileen's tacky glue, and the hot glue, and the glue stick, I found that when you're trying to stick on larger clumps of it, go with the hot glue. If you're just trying to get one particular strand or two just to stick in place, the glue stick is the easiest application method. Now here you can see I've got this little bit of an ugly gap, but I have this lichen that I got at my local Hobby Lobby, and that covers it up really nicely. Again, easy thing to just hot glue in place, and it looks really natural, and it adds a lot of life to the piece. You can also use this lichen to create some really big patches of crawling ivy that look really, really nice in these wilderness settings. Here you can see I kind of started on that second bone from the left, worked it around, and then draped it down the side of this piece. It's another one of those little details that I just think really helps tie these pieces together. Once you've done all of that flocking, it's time to add just a little bit of grass and dirt to our piece. And for that, we're going to take some white PVA glue and spread it across anywhere where we've got a large flat surface. You can use the nozzle for some of the smaller areas, but for larger spaces, just pull the cap off and pour it out. Then spread it around and make sure you get a nice even coat with an old brush. You can also go ahead and stipple some of the excess glue in a couple of different places, just to add places where a little bit of moss or other vegetation might be growing on the rocks. Once you've got the glue everywhere you want it, we can go ahead and add our flocking. I like to do a bit of an undercoat with this brown that I got from my local Hobby Lobby, just because it adds a little bit more earthiness and a little bit of variety. Then, once I've got that, I come in with a little bit heavier layer of the green to add that vibrancy and life to the piece. This is another one of those steps that you do to taste. Use whatever color flocking or style of flocking best fits your setting, and apply as much or as little as you see fit till it looks good to you. Once everything is dry, there's nothing left to do but to throw it on the battle mat and see the results of our hard work. I really like how I was able to squeeze a lot of variety of terrain out of some very simple base components. This would be a really stunning battlefield to play on for any fantasy war game. And the nice thing is, we've created more than most sets will need for your base game. For instance, Age of Sigmar only requires 8 pieces of terrain, but here, we've created a lot more than that. So, you can swap terrain pieces out and always have a fresh looking board to play on. This could also be a really cool encounter for a game like Dungeons & Dragons, where a necromancer who is raising an army of the undead has uncovered the bones of an ancient titan that he wishes to add to his forces. The possibilities with a build like this are pretty endless, and you can always make minor tweaks to the layout or the color scheme or any other little detail to really make this piece your own. If you enjoyed this video, give us a like and subscribe to the channel to keep up to date on all of our future projects. If you have any ideas for things you'd like to see me build, leave them in the comments below and I'll see what I can do. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again the next time we ignite the Forge of Sagas.